Mexico men's trip. Randy got interested in climbing while visiting his in-laws at Estes Park. Before I knew it, he was teaching all of us the basics of rock climbing, which he learned through various courses. Since we then started to consider ourselves as mountain climbers and proved such with short trips to New Mexico and Colorado, it was only natural that we planned the epic adventure to central Mexico to climb Pico de Orizaba. This is the highest peak in Mexico at just over 19,000 feet and maintains a permanent glacier above 16,000 feet, even though it lies in a tropical forest 200 miles to the southeast of Mexico City. The mountain is truly formidable and we decided to climb it. We made a practice climb of Mount Wheeler in New Mexico. Practice of self-arrest with the ice axes and crevasse rescue techniques with the ropes and crampons was a necessity. We were not completely green. Randy had climbed Mount McKinley in Alaska, and I had done several winter trips to Colorado and New Mexico. Bob, Poe and Peter were the other two members of the expedition. Peter was the youngest at 22 years, but he had experienced problems while climbing in New Mexico. He was in super physical shape, but the high altitude would cause him real problems. It was a Thanksgiving holiday trip and we flew directly into Mexico City from DFW. Randy and Peter, both being Volkswagen mechanics, rented a Volkswagen van for the trip to the mountain. We decided to first do a little sightseeing out to the pyramids. Would you believe that just outside the city, on a barren stretch of road, the Volkswagen decided to shed a flywheel? The mechanics pronounced the motor dead without a new part. Suddenly, as if by magic, a teenager came walking up to see what the problem was. By hand signs we conveyed that we needed this part. He nodded his head and took off jogging down the road. Randy decided he had better go with him, so he took out after the boy. Down the road in a wooden shack was a parts store, and within the hour we were on our way again to the pyramids. The next morning, at 4:30 a.m., to avoid the terrible traffic we headed into the wilderness. Our first view of Orizaba was from 50 miles away. It is so big. It is beautiful, with a perfect volcanic cone rising out of the countryside, a shining white top and black volcanic base. We stopped in the town located on the last hardtop road. We bought fruit, cokes, barbecue sandwiches and stocked up at the local store. The store had a tattered old book that served as a climbing register for the mountain. There are all sorts of famous names from the climbing world scratched in this book. The original owner of the store has died though, and the young people running the old store didn't seem to be impressed with the value of the book. The next part of the trip was spent trying to find our way to the mountain. The road out of town ended up being an alley that emptied out into a cornfield. A pair of ruts through one field to another finally snaked its way closer and closer to the mountain. Another small village found us giving away our bakery goods bought in Mexico City to a horde of dirty begging kids. We had pulled into this seemingly empty farm village, asked this one kid which way to the mountain road, and gave him a cookie for his effort in helping us. Instantly there was a mass of pushing and shoving kids, and our cookies were all gone. Leaving this village, we took another wrong path and ended up having to hang off the van doors like outriggers on a sailboat to keep it from turning over. I was truly scared that we would roll over and down into the ravine. After backing down this section of mountain we tried another and another until finally a group of peons digging potatoes in a field confirmed that we were on the road to the mountain. The funny thing about all this searching for the right road is that we were actually on the mountain. As we drove on, the oxygen got thinner and thinner, and the road got steeper and steeper, and the Volkswagen got sicker and sicker. At first, we would jump out and push or run along beside the van while it labored over a steep place. Soon, we were pushing and running the whole way. We would jump out, slam the doors, and push like hell. I jumped out one time and was pushing my guts out when I noticed Bob was just running along beside the van holding on letting the van pull him up the grade. Between gulps of air, I yelled, "Damn it Bob, get back here and push." I was mad as hell at him loafing while Peter and I were hard at it. We cleared the top of the grade and I ran back up to jump in the van. It was then I realized I had slammed the door on Bob's hand, and he was being dragged along speechless from the pain, trying to get the door open to release himself. Finally, we could run and push no more. The clutch was burning out and we were burning out. No sooner had we given up than along came an old four-wheel drive pickup with two Mexican men. They volunteered to push the van over the steep spots and Bob, Peter, and I rode in the back of the pickup. We arrived at the climbing hut just before dark. The hut was made of rock with sleeping shelves inside for perhaps up to 30 people. We were the only ones there. The hut was at 14,000 feet and you could see for miles in all directions as you sat outside on the rocks. We went inside and started to prepare some food for supper. A young Mexican climber walked in about that time and we invited him to eat with us. He spoke a little English and was impressed that we would share our food and company. He told us he was a guide and was to lead a group up the mountain the next day. We asked him lots of questions about the mountain since we were kind of winging it on our own. He assured us that there would be no problems except for the ratas and the bandidos. We didn't know what he meant by ratas, but bandidos caught our attention right away. He said a man and woman climber had been shot and robbed a week before. The murderers had not been caught, but not to worry, that kind of thing didn't happen too often. 2. The cold was closing in and we retired to our sleeping bags for the few short hours before we were to start the climb. Our schedule was to rise at 2:30, pack our packs, start the climb with headlights, and be on the ice by daybreak. As soon as the lights went out, we realized what the guide meant by ratas. The rats sounded like a herd of pigs running around on the sleeping shelves and in the walls. You could even feel them run across the top of the sleeping bags occasionally. Sleep was out of the question. On top of this, Peter was sick and making all kinds of strange noises. Perhaps all the distractions were good though, because my and everyone else's mind kept conjuring up visions of the bandidos murdering us and no one knowing what had happened. Suddenly there were loud, rowdy voices getting closer and closer to the hut from the dark. They were speaking in Spanish and did not sound cheerful. The door to the hut burst open and I thought it was the end. My reaction was the same as the rest of the residents of the hut. We all lay there in our bags as quiet as little mice. There were lights flashing through the hut and you could smell tequila in the clear mountain air. Suddenly the beams settled on each of our bags one after the other as if taking account. You could feel the weight of the light beam as it exposed each of us in turn. Several minutes of terror passed before we recognized the voice of our new friend, the Mexican guide mixed in with the other rowdy members of the group that had set upon our hut. We then learned that this was a group of 10 Mexican climbers that were going to challenge the mountain along with us at first light. After no more than 2 hours of sleep, at 2 a.m., we rose to make final preparations for the climb. Our Mexican counterparts were outfitted with boots that had nails driven through the soles where we had chenard crampons. They had long wooden handle ice axes where we had lightweight aluminum handle axes with nylon leashes. They had no ropes, no extra clothes, none of the high-tech climbing gear we were burdened with. They did have one great asset. They were from a large metropolitan city this side of Mexico City that was situated at about 6,000 feet altitude. They were much more acclimated to the altitude than us flatlanders. We left the hut and started up the broken granite slope with anticipation, exhilaration, and a little fear of the coming hours. The headlamps flashed from one boulder to another and the darkness of the mountain seemed to swallow us as we struggled up and up. We knew it was 3 hours till daylight, but the searching for footholds and concentration made the darkness pass quickly. As the glow from the east increased, we realized the Mexican group of climbers had taken another route that separated us by several hundred yards. They already had gained a lead and were climbing much faster with their lighter loads. The strengthening light revealed 2 small tents hastily set up at the foot of the glacier. These must belong to the gringo climbers from Houston that had hastily passed by the hut the previous afternoon. They had stopped just long enough to brag about their credentials as alpinists and of their previous conquests. We were at 16,000 feet elevation and the Houston boys were breaking camp as we approached up the ice-strewn path. They were amazed at the rats that had eaten holes in their sleeping bags during the night. You got to wonder what they eat when the climbers aren't there. We climbed to the tongue of ice that marked the beginning of the glacier and proceeded to don crampons, harnesses, and ropes. Peter was acting strangely and had been lagging behind. This was strange since he was the youngster of the group at 22 years old and had trained for months by running the UTA stadium stairs with a 40-pound backpack full of bricks slung across his shoulder. Ropes are considered necessary on Orizaba because even though the beautiful white smooth cone appears to be solid ice, it actually is laced with crevasses. Falling into one of these bottomless ice cracks can result in broken limbs, hypothermia, and even death in less than an hour unless you are equipped to effect a quick rescue. We had practiced the techniques required to haul someone out, but fear was still in every footstep. Our rope had Randy in the lead. He was the only one that actually knew what a hidden crevasse might look like. The inexperienced Peter and then Bob were in the middle. I was tied onto the end of the rope. Moving up the 60-degree ice face with 4 people tied on one 160-foot rope requires teamwork. Ours was not the best, and the rope of Houston boys soon began to pull a lead on us. This was discouraging since the ropeless Mexican group was practically out of sight above in the wispy clouds that occasionally would enclose the summit. Suddenly Peter stopped, turned, and abruptly slumped in a pile on the ice. Each of us looked to see why the rope had stopped moving and saw him clutching his head in his hands. Each step at altitude takes a distinct energy output, and every one of us knew this output was limited. So everyone just stood there for 5 minutes or so wondering what was wrong with Peter but not willing to move to find out. Finally, Randy stepped back down the rope toward Peter. Another 10 minutes passed. Randy stood up and yelled down to Bob and I that Peter was in trouble and could go no higher. He and Peter stood up, unroped, and proceeded laterally to an outcropping of rocks about 100 yards away. After returning, he yelled back that Peter was going to sit and wait in the outcropping for our return. The rope started moving upward again after this almost 1-hour delay. Plant the ice axe, step straight up the 60-degree grade, and shift your weight to that foot. Plant the ice axe, step up with the other foot, and shift your weight to that foot. Over and over, one at a time, breath, step, step. Your Achilles tendons begin to ache, so you start using the French technique. The crampons are placed at an angle to the fall line of the mountain and you zigzag up the ice step after step. Soon the bending of the ankle required by the French technique starts to rub blisters inside the stiff plastic boots. The dark patches of rock that have been stretching away as we inched in their direction finally seem close enough to be our next rest stop. Finally, 2 hours after leaving Peter, we slump into the shelter of the rocks. They provide a platform where we can unrope, relax, and partake of some nourishment. The exertion has made it difficult to eat, and even the water in our bottles seems hard to swallow. It is about noon. We are at less than 17,000 feet and the summit looms more than 2,000 feet up into the thickening clouds. Bob announces that he can go no higher and is worried about Peter. Bob starts back down the icy slab and Randy and I look at each other in silence. I am exhausted and the summit seems impossible, but I am here and know that I can go higher, so this is the time to give it all you have. I also know that the body is capable of going beyond most people's expectations. As Randy and I roped up, we didn't realize that a small drama was being played out by Bob and the sick Peter. He was barely conscious and completely unable to stand. We now surmise that he was suffering from cerebral edema, a hemorrhaging in the brain that is fatal and can only be cured by the healing of higher pressure and oxygen of lower altitude. Bob dragged him to his feet and they started stumbling step by step down the dangerous trail. Peter would fall from exhaustion, vomit, and gulp for air, then just lay there and moan. After a few minutes, Bob would drag him to his feet again and they would stumble a few more yards down the trail before they would both fall from exhaustion again. They reached the hut at 14,000 feet at about 5 o'clock and Peter had already started regaining his composure. Peter suffered no permanent damage thanks to Bob, and we all learned an important lesson about high altitude. While Bob and Peter were struggling down the mountain, Randy and I were mindlessly moving step by step up the glacier. Suddenly my senses were jolted as if by an electric shock as my foot dropped through the icy surface halfway up to my knee. The ice had a different texture, a different color. I was standing over a gaping crevasse on a bridge of snow. Randy had already crossed, and in my monotonous stupor I had not even noticed his change in pace. He was on the other side. I was already 2 steps over the edge, nothing to do but move ahead. Each step made the blood rush as my foot sunk into the mushy snow which supported my weight. A few steps more and finally the safety of the hard glacier ice under my feet. The 12 points of our crampons which we had filed to needle points only penetrated the hard ice 1/8 of an inch. This means that a headlong tumble down the slope could hardly be stopped by the accepted methods of self-arrest using the ice axe. You would slide or tumble faster and faster down the rink-hard ice face with the boulders at the foot of the glacier rushing toward you like a freight train. Don't think about it. You have learned from your trials riding motorcycle days that to visualize disaster is to create it. This type of ice is no problem, just don't fall. Suddenly the clouds close if and there is a total whiteout. There is no up, there is no down. The white glare of the ice and the swirling white ice crystals in the cloud create a maelstrom that sends the senses spinning. Quickly I start chopping a small bench in the ice. I need a place to sit. I am dizzy, and I could fall. I sit on the small step facing down the slope with my knees bent into a squat and the steep edges of the crampons in the ice. I beat the ice axe into the slope between my legs and begin to feel a little security. For a man of 45 years of age, the 18,000-foot altitude seems to have limited effect. I am a little lightheaded, have a small aching in my head, but energy is the real enemy. Another 1,000 feet to go, zero visibility, light snow, and absolutely not an ounce of energy left in my system. As I sit there in the swirling white world, I start to analyze the situation. I realize that if I am going to get back, I cannot go any farther. It is after 5 o'clock, we have been climbing for 15 hours and it is going to be dark in less than 2 more hours. About that time Randy moves into view and chops a seat beside me. I tell him I can go no further. He says he wants to try it some more and proceeds to unrope. As he moves out of sight up the slope, my situation starts to unfold in my mind. How long do I wait for his return? It is very dangerous to proceed unroped into the whiteout. Even if he returns safely, will he be able to find me? The ice is so hard we are leaving no tracks and we lost the small colored flags that marked the route hours ago. I decide to wait for 45 minutes and then start down on my own. The minutes drag by and I agonize for his safety and the gravity of my decision to start down by myself. The crunch of footsteps and he is back. Made a couple of 100 yards more but decided it was too dangerous. The exhaustion, the lack of oxygen, the impending darkness, all influenced our decision to proceed down the slope unroped. We didn't attempt to follow our previous route, we just headed down. As the sun started setting, we realized that if we missed the couloir in which the hut was located, we would end up spending the night out. That would be no catastrophe, but Bob and Peter would assume we had been in an accident. Suddenly the clouds parted below us and we could see the black spear of the couloir in which the hut was located. The last few steps off the glacier and onto the rocks were like setting foot on dry land after a long voyage at sea. It took me more than 20 minutes just to remove my crampons and store them on my pack. My exhaustion was indescribable. As I moved down the rocky path I stumbled and fell several times, but the hut got closer and closer in the fading light. Just as I could start to make out small figures around the hut, my energy level got a gigantic boost of pure adrenaline. Boom, boom, 2 shots rang out and my head popped up in time to see small puffs of smoke emerge from one of the figures. The story of the banditos and the murders told us the previous night suddenly jumped into reality. I stood there transfixed, gazing down at the figures, trying to make some sense of the seemingly random movements around the hut. Should I move closer? Should I hide? Randy was a couple 100 yards farther down the trail and after a few minutes of standing and staring he started moving toward the hut. Where else did I have to go? So down I went also. The tension was finally released when I began to recognize Bob in the gathering of people. A new group of climbers had arrived from the US and upon hearing of the murders, they had hired the local sheriff to protect them on the climb. To demonstrate his prowess, he had blasted a couple of rounds off with his shotgun. As fast as exhausted men can move, we threw our gear in the Volkswagen van, bummed a tow up a steep section, and headed down toward Timberline. You would think the shotgun scare would put a final climax on an extraordinary day, but someone had another idea. As the van bumped and pitched down the road, our headlights began to shine on the giant pine trees growing just below Timberline. We were weaving between the trees when suddenly across the road lay 3 of these giants blocking our path. The other group of climbers had driven up this same road only hours before, so the trees must have been felled in the last few minutes. As the van slowly braked to a halt, we frantically started rolling up the windows as if this would provide protection from rifles or pistols. We sat there in the dark waiting for something to happen, but there was total silence. The smell of the pine tar from the wood shavings filled the air and confirmed our fears that the trees had been felled to block the road. After a very long minute or two, I decided that we had to find a way around the logs and that if someone was waiting it might as well be now as later. I piled out of the Volkswagen with my flashlight and started leading a path through the pine forest. Randy revved the engine and the van lurched around through the trees. Back in the van, on the road, and we were on our way to Vera Cruz. Mexico men's trip road to Vera Cruz. The Mexican highways and especially their mountain highways should never be driven at night. We knew of no place to stay, however, and headed for Vera Cruz. Randy was driving and he is a good driver, but the roads were dark, they were unmarked, it was foggy, we all were exhausted. I decided that if I was to die in a car wreck I might as well be asleep and happy. The only time I woke was when Randy hit the topaz. He saw the sign, he asked, "What are topaz?" He hit the 8-inch high-speed bumps, topaz, at approximately 60 miles per hour. Everything in the van hit the ceiling, including me. I rose up and said, "What's wrong?" Randy repeated, "What the hell are topaz?" I replied, "Those are speed bumps," and went back to sleep. A warm bed in a nice hotel in Vera Cruz, Saturday night music vibrating through the walls, and the mountain was finally behind us. There was no agenda, we knew nothing about the city, so we asked the hotel clerk what to do. "Go see the Spanish fortress," he advised, and we were on our way. The fortress was built to handle the cargo for the Spanish galleons that were bleeding the riches of the New World. Gold and silver were brought from the Aztecs and Indians of the interior and stored here at the fortress of Vera Cruz until the galleons arrived to return to Spain. The fortress also served as a torture dungeon to keep the Indians in line. The Indians were used as slave labor and their domination was necessary since the number of Spanish conquistadors was limited. The buildings were formed from coral blocks that had been hand-carved by the Indians from the reef. The style was Spanish Inquisition architecture with a bent to the grotesque. Inside the rooms the iron shackles and red stains of blood were still soaked into the coral stone. In the courtyard of the fortress, we were approached by an old Indian man who asked if he could guide us. We hesitatingly accepted when he insisted that his fee was very reasonable and that he had personally guided the King of Spain some years back. This old man proved to be one of the high points of the trip, and I regret that my memory of his tales were not as clear as his. He had grown up in an Indian village on the slopes of Pico de Orizaba, our mountain. As a boy of 7, hunger drove him to walk the 150 miles to Vera Cruz in search of food and shelter. One of the many ships visiting this port accepted him as a galley boy and his career in the merchant marine was born. He said he had been all over the world when at 9 years old the ship visited Boston Harbor. He went ashore with one of the cooks to visit this new country. The cook got drunk and returned to the ship without the boy, leaving him marooned in this strange land. He wandered around the docks for a couple of days trying to find his ship, but it had departed. His problem was compounded because he spoke an Indian dialect with practically no Spanish. Like a miracle he stumbled into an Indian in Boston who could communicate with him. This man got him a job selling papers on the streets and he learned English by shouting the headlines. After a year or two in the US, he returned to the sea and made his living this way until middle age. In his 40s he returned to Vera Cruz, married, and had children. These children were now grown and he made a simple life by guiding people through the old Spanish fortress. The man was extraordinary. His worldly experience, his intellect, and his self-education, packaged in an old Indian guide, were like finding a gemstone. He filled us with stories of the Spanish throwing Indian bodies out of the dungeons into the saltwater moats filled with sharks. His view of Cortez was definitely from the Indian viewpoint. Our day was fascinating. The next day we piled in the van and explored the asphalt roads running near the beach outside of town. We noticed several cars heading in the same direction and followed out of curiosity. It was Sunday and we arrived in a holiday village for the people of Vera Cruz. It had many restaurants and bars, boat rides along the bayous, and seafood galore. We spent the rest of the day sitting under thatched roofs, eating boiled shrimp, drinking Mexican wine, and listening to the mariachi bands. We were the only white faces in the hundreds of people in the village. The return to Mexico City and the jetliner that would bring us back into reality was relatively uneventful. The puny passing ability of the Volkswagen, the two-lane mountain highway, and the huge trucks high-balling down the windy road did make for white knuckles and thin lips. Randy had a European climbing trip a couple of years later. Peter decided high altitude was not for him again but had no ill effects from his problem. Bob came down with something like pneumonia. He blamed it on the smog in Mexico City, but I suspect he had a little case of pulmonary edema. This was my last big mountain adventure to date, but who knows, maybe I will get to climb in Europe also someday.